beasts, horns, a ram, a goat, and lots of years today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Buckle up, Buttercup. Get your coffee and your tea ready and get comfortable because it's going to be an epic adventure and a super long video. Okay, not too awful long, but I will tell you that we could probably spend a month on each one of these chapters. We're going through Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 9 tonight, and tomorrow we're going to go through 10, 11, and 12. Well, you can, like I said, I promise this won't be a 3-month long video because I don't know that I can record that long, but I'm going to try to get through tonight some of the visions and some of what that means historically speaking through this book of Daniel. So let's dive into it and let's see what Daniel has in store for us tonight. Now, the book of Daniel, this chapter, chapter 7, is probably one of the most important of the entire Old Testament, and it is an essential guide to biblical prophecy. The vision of the Son of Man is the centerpiece of Old Testament revelation concerning the Messiah, who is Jesus. So right away, chapter 7, verse 1, Belshazzar became the co-regent with Nabonidus in 553 BC, and we have consistently here been assuming that Daniel was about 15 when he was exiled to Babylon, and he would have received this vision when he was approximately 67 years old. So the events that are taking place here in chapter 7 happened before Daniel chapter 5. Now, we get into verse 3. These 4 huge beasts that you see on your screen here, they represent the 4 nations that were previously identified in the vision of the Colossus in Daniel chapter 2. Do y'all remember that big old statue? There it was, that big old statue from Daniel chapter 2. Those are the same countries that are mentioned in chapter 2. So let's get to these. The lion with the eagle's wings in chapter 4, that represented the Babylonian Empire, of course, and some biblical passages represent Nebuchadnezzar as a lion, and then other biblical passages such as Jeremiah chapter 49 also represent him as an eagle. So there's that kind of a combination of eagle and lion in that depiction there. The wings being torn off later here represents Nebuchadnezzar's madness, or the going crazy time in his life, and the lions being set on its feet like a man indicated that he was restored. The bear here with the 3 ribs in its mouth represents the Medo-Persian Empire and its 3 main conquests. Babylon in 539 BC, Lydia in 546 BC, and Egypt in 525 BC. Now, its lopsided nature, how it's kind of leaning to one side there, expresses the Persian dominance in this joint empire. The leopard here represents the Greek Empire. Its 4 wings refers to the speed of Alexander's conquests. And, of course, the 4 heads represent the 4 principal sections of the empire: Greece and Macedonia, Thrace and Asia Minor, Syria and Babylon, and Egypt and Israel. So the 4th beast here represents the Roman Empire. Now, it was different from the previous 3 because it was more powerful and it had longer dominion. The horns commonly represent kings, and of course there were 10 horns on this one, so possibly representing 10 kings. Possibly. The little horn, though, that was on it represents a king who starts out small in power but becomes dominant later. Now, this little horn is a future ruler, not one that's happened yet, and the scripture also calls the coming ruler the king who will do whatever he wants in chapter 11, or the man of lawlessness, or the man of doomed, that is doomed to destruction in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He is called the beast in Revelation chapter 13, and he is called the Antichrist in 1 John chapter 2. The phrase, the Ancient of Days, in verses 9 and 10 here, that refers to God's eternal nature. We get to verses 13 and 14. The Son of Man here is none other than the divine Messiah himself, Jesus. And Jesus understood it to be a messianic title as well in Mark chapter 14, verses 61 and 62, and he actually used it to speak about himself. So that's kind of how we know that this specific Son of Man phrase was used to mean Jesus. The holy ones of the Most High in verse 18 is most likely a reference to Israel when the nation turns in faith to their Messiah, Jesus. We'll read about that in Zechariah 12 and Romans chapter 11. Get to verses 19 through 24 here of chapter 7, and after a summary of the vision's meaning, the angel here explains that the fourth kingdom in its future state will devour the whole earth, indicating world domination. The 10 kings, as we talked about, it could be a metaphor for completeness, but more likely it refers to an empire that literally has a confederation of 10 different kings all together, working together as one. In verses 24 through 26, another king, or the Antichrist, is described in the vision as the little horn, and he will arise and take control of this last human empire by subduing the other three kings. He will be characterized by blasphemy, or words against the Most High, as it's written here in the Scripture, anti-Semitism, and it's written here in Scripture that says he will oppress the holy ones of the Most High. That's the anti-Semitism. And, of course, he'll be represented by religious corruption, as he will intend to change religious festivals and laws. He's going to oppress the Jewish people for, as it says in Scripture, times, and half a time, meaning 3 1/2 years, or the second half of the future tribulation that's talked about in Revelation chapter 7. Now, this oppression is yet to happen. It hasn't happened yet. And when the heavenly court will convene, as it's written here, the Antichrist will be completely destroyed forever. We get to verse 27. It says, the Son of Man will take his throne and rule over his everlasting kingdom. Then the people, the believing remnant of Israel here, who are also called holy ones, will receive this kingdom under the authority of their Messiah, the Son of Man. So that brings us into chapter 8. Look here, a statue's still there. So we've got Daniel chapter 2 statue. Then we've got Daniel chapter 7's animals. And now we've got a couple more animals added to Daniel chapter 8. How interesting is that? So Daniel chapter 8 all the way through chapter 12 verse 13, which is the last chapter of Daniel, was written in Hebrew, focusing on God's people during the times of the Gentiles. The vision in Daniel chapter 8 predicted events that involved the second and third world empires within a time frame from the 6th to the 2nd century BC, or 500 to 100 BC roughly, or the 500s to the 100s. Belshazzar became co-regent with Nabonidus, as we said, in 553 BC. We're still assuming that Daniel was 15 when he was exiled to Babylon, so he would have received this vision in about 550 BC, when he was about 70 years old. So we're still a little bit before Daniel chapter 5, but after Daniel chapter 7. And as in the previous chapter, Daniel saw a vision of animals that stood for world empires. First, he saw the ram, representing the Medo-Persian Empire. It had 2 horns representing the 2 nations in this confederated empire. One was longer than the other, and the longer one came up last, signifying the dominant status of Persia in the empire. Even though when they first started, Persia was actually weaker, later on during the empire, Persia was the stronger of the 2. Most of the conquest of the ram here, or the Medo-Persian Empire, were to the west, the north, and the south, as it says here in the Scripture. Daniel also saw a male goat. Now, this represented the Greek Empire. The goat's conspicuous horn, though, that big long one in the middle, it represents Alexander the Great. And the goat crossed the surface of the entire earth, and this is so rapidly that it did not touch the ground. This refers to Alexander's really speedy conquest of the Near East in only 3 years' time, which is unheard of. The goat struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and that indicated that the Greek Empire's crushing of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that actually happened in the year 331 BC. We have history books that tell about that. In chapter 8, verse 8, at the height of his power, a large horn was broken. And now this refers to Alexander's sudden death at the peak of his greatness in 323 BC. His kingdom was divided by his 4 generals into 4 conspicuous horns. The Bible talks about those 4 conspicuous horns. Those were those 4 generals that replaced Alexander, as opposed to the little horn that will come from the 4th kingdom, or Rome, as described in chapter 7. A different little horn emerged out of the 4 kingdoms that divided the Greek Empire. This one was Antiochus IV, and he ruled from 175 BC to 163 BC. And he conquered surrounding areas to the south and to the east, as it says here, but especially dominated the beautiful land, which is referring to Israel. Antiochus blasphemously presented himself as the prince of the heavenly army, or God himself. He called himself the Prince of Princes, and he stopped regular sacrifices, and he defiled the holy temple, his sanctuary in Jerusalem. He was successful in everything that he did, but only temporarily to a point. An angel announced that Antiochus's defilement of Israel would last only 2,300 evenings and mornings, and that's in verse 13 and 14. Here's what we're talking about. Until the temple was rededicated by Judas Maccabeus in 164 BC. This event is still celebrated by the Jews today. Did you know that? And they celebrate this during their festival of dedication, or Hanukkah, however you want to pronounce it. We get to verses 15 and 16 in chapter 8, and Daniel received the interpretation of this vision from the angel Gabriel. Dun, 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 dun. Gabriel is super important. He's also going to give the message of Daniel's 70 weeks in chapter 9 here in a minute. And he announced the birth of John the Baptist to Zechariah in Luke chapter 1. And he also announced the birth of the Messiah Jesus to Mary in Luke chapter 1 verse 26. So Gabriel is this amazing angel messenger of God, and he addressed Daniel as Son of Man. But he did not use the Hebrew equivalent of the Aramaic title given to the Messiah. This was a different term used for Son of Man. The phrase that he used here emphasizes the actual human weakness and the mortality of Daniel. And Gabriel also indicated that the vision referred to the time of the end. Antiochus, as the little horn of chapter 8, he typifies the coming end time Antichrist. In other words, the Antichrist is going to be just like him, as opposed to actually being him. So although this chapter does directly refer to Antiochus, it also pertains to the end times. Thus, there is a double fulfillment, so to speak, in this message. There's the fulfillment through Antiochus, but there's also the fulfillment in the end times later on. So 18 through 22 begins the interpretation of the ram and the goat. And then in 23 through 25, after a summary explanation of Daniel's vision, Gabriel expanded his description of Antiochus. And he would take the throne through deceit against the rightful heirs, his nephew Demetrius. His great power would not be his own, but would have a satanic source. So he would succeed at first, defeating powerful rulers and generals and destroying many of God's holy people, Israel, and deceive himself, thinking that he himself was great enough to oppose God. Nevertheless, he would ultimately and suddenly be broken, not through assassination or battle, but through some ailment that was sent by God. Now in verse 26, Gabriel instructed Daniel to seal up the vision, not for the purpose of hiding its meaning from faithful readers of Scripture, but rather to secure the document for safekeeping into the distant future, meaning the time of Antiochus, some 400 years after the vision was given, and the time of the Antichrist, which is yet to happen and is typified by Antiochus. Now in verse 27, Daniel said here that he did not understand the timing of the events, their full implications, or the identity of the evil king who would oppress the Jews. But history has proven that the vision is true. Now we're going to move on into chapter 9. as we finish up today, I'll give you a timeline here. I did a lot of research, and this is one that kind of just gives you a typical, this is what the 70 weeks prophecy timeline could be. You could probably find 50 or 60 of these timelines, but this one was probably the most helpful and the most relatable to me. Daniel here would have been about 81 years old at the time of this vision. The name Ahasuerus was probably a Persian royal title rather than a person's name here. It refers to an ancestor of Cyrus the Great or Governor Gubaru, not Ahasuerus, who was the king mentioned in the book of Esther in 485 to 465 BC. Different dude. Although the book of Jeremiah in verse 2 here was mentioned, Jeremiah was completed only a generation before the events described here in Daniel chapter 9, but Daniel had already recognized it as scripture and as holy. Jeremiah predicted that the desolation of Jerusalem would endure for 70 years in Jeremiah chapter 25 and chapter 29. Now, Daniel calculated that since the first captives had been taken to Babylon in 605 BC, the 70 years were nearly complete by then during Daniel's time. So Daniel's prayer was with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes here, 3 customary ways to express sorrow and contrition. We get all the way to verse 21, and the angel Gabriel appears again for the second time here in Daniel. Here he is called a man, but we know he was an angel, but this was because he appeared in human form, not because he was a man, because clearly Gabriel was an angel. Verses 22 through 24 talks about the 70 weeks of years. So 70 weeks probably refers to 70 periods of time, and those periods of time were probably 7 years each. So we're talking about 490 years worth of time, during which 6 objectives would be accomplished. The first 3 pertain to bringing rebellion, sin, and iniquity to an end, and the final 3 relate to consummating prophetic events by bringing in a kingdom of everlasting righteousness, fulfilling vision and prophecy, and also setting apart the most holy place, referring to the yet literal millennial temple that Ezekiel was talking about in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48. Now, we get to verse 25. It's very likely that the decree, that is the beginning point, is Artaxerxes' second decree in 444 BC, which is up here, or 457 BC, depending on where you find your information. This was authorizing Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8 is where we get this part from. There will be a period of about 7 weeks of years, or 49 years, followed by 62 weeks of years, or 434 more years, making a total of 69 weeks of years, or 483 years, from the decree until the coming of an anointed one, the ruler. So the starting point of the prophecy would have begun on Nisan the 1st, or March the 5th on our calendar, of 444 BC, followed by 69 weeks of 360-day biblical prophetic years, or 173,880 days, and culminated in Nisan the 10th, or March 30th, AD 33, the date that Jesus, the Messiah, triumphantly entered into the city of Jerusalem, that we read about in Luke chapter 19, verses 28 through 40. We get to verse 26 here, chapter 9, and several events are said to follow the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, or the 69-week total. First, the anointed one will be cut off, a prediction of the death of the Messiah Jesus. Thus, the book of Daniel, written in the 6th century BC, predicted not only the precise date of the Messiah's coming, but also that the Messiah will be put to death sometime before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This was fulfilled when Jesus was crucified in AD 33 or AD 30, according to some interpreters, depending on which commentary you read. And second, the people of the coming ruler would destroy the city of Jerusalem and the second temple. The coming ruler probably is a reference to the future ruler described as the little horn in Daniel 7, also known as the beast or the Antichrist. He's not said to be the one to destroy Jerusalem and the temple, rather it is his people who will do it. Since Daniel chapter 7 clearly viewed this ruler as coming from the fourth major world power, or Rome, this prophecy predicts that the Romans would destroy Jerusalem, as they did in AD 70. Now third, there appears to be a significant time gap from the end of the 69th week to the beginning of the 70th week, as you will see here on your timeline on your screen. Now, in the final 7-year period, or the 70th week, will begin when he, or the coming prince, will make a firm covenant of peace with many in the leadership of Israel. The Antichrist will desecrate the future temple and put a stop to worship there. This covenant is yet to happen, of course, and will mark the beginning of the time of oppression of the Jewish people, called a time of trouble for Jacob, which is mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 30, or the tribulation period in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark chapter 13. In the middle of the week, or after the first 3.5 years, after the first 3.5 years, the Antichrist will break his covenant with Israel, leading to a time of unprecedented persecution of the Jewish people and the followers of Jesus, as we see in Revelation chapter 7, that will last for another 3.5 years. So that's half of the 7 years there in that last block you see in Daniel's 70th week. When the Antichrist breaks the covenant, he's going to put a stop to all sacrifice in the rebuilt temple and will commit the abomination of desolation, as we see in Matthew chapter 24, desecrating the temple and declaring himself to be God. The Antichrist's oppression and abomination will continue until God's decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator, which we'll see again in chapter 11 and also in Revelation chapter 19. Dun, 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 dun. That ends the epic saga of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband today. I hope this helps your studying, and if you read this along with this video, I hope that gives you some insight as to what all of this means. Like I said, we could probably spend 3 months just studying those 3 chapters, going in depth and looking at the historical references that happened. It's just a fantastic read. I love Daniel, and I hope you're enjoying this too. So, click that like button, subscribe button, of course, hit the follow button, hit your little jingle bell to get notified the next time I upload a video, and click that little boxing glove if you're rumbling with me on Rumble. And I'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. We'll see you then.